For Pillar Sports, a podcast for sports fans, made by sports fans. Join Chris and Randy every week as they dive deep into football, basketball, baseball, and professional wrestling. Catch For Pillar Sports on all major platforms. And remember, keep on talking sports.
This is your girl, Yannick Taylor, aka Priestess, hostess of Conversations with the Priestess. Here's a preview of what you may hear on Conversations with the Priestess.
We weren't meant for monogamy, let's be honest. Like, we have needs, let's be real. And communicating that, what you want, what you don't want, what sets up the... Now, this drink is brown, because I learned something. Since I'm older, I can't do brown liquor anymore. Also, I noticed since I started on hormone replacement there, HRT, in 2015, me and certain liquors don't match well. I don't know whether...
And I recognize that a lot of men love to be dominated by women. And that's because men are seen as these leaders, as this big alpha male dominant being. And because they're put on this pedestal of being leaders, sometimes they want to be submissive. Back when I cosplayed a Butch Queen in South Carolina around 2011, I was on Craigslist. This is when Craigslist was bumping and before they had gotten rid of the personal section. I hope you enjoyed that preview. Join me on Wednesdays at 9 p.m. for Priestess After Dark. Full video versions of the podcast can be found on patreon.com/CWT Priestess, and join me on Fridays at noon for our regular Friday post. Live, love, and be free. Smooches.
Available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, anywhere you download and stream podcasts.
On April 21st, 1836, at about 3:30 in the afternoon, Sam Houston's army formed about a 1,000-yard line at the edge of the woods in which they had encamped. The sun would set in about 4 hours at 6:52. Whatever was about to happen in the light of day must happen in that brief window of opportunity. The cool of the morning had been replaced by the warmth of the afternoon sun at their backs. They formed ranks in the trees. James Gillespie, a captain of the 2nd Regiment, recalled that General Houston mounted his gray horse and spoke to every captain as he rode down the line. Then the infantry, shielded by a grove of trees, marched forward out of camp in columns of twos, and then turned left to cross the field. Sidney Sherman commanded the 2nd Regiment on the left end of the line, close to the marshland, and the same side on which the Mexican army was encamped. Secretary of War Rusk, having been rescued the day before by the daring action of the Georgia poet Mirabeau Lamar, was again in Sherman's ranks. Captain Juan Seguin and his Tejano Volunteer Company were also with Sherman on the left. Edward Burleson commanded the 1st Regiment to the Sherman's right. George W. Hockley, who had served as the Inspector General for the Army, was in command of the 2 artillery pieces, the Twin Sisters to the right, and a little forward of the 1st Regiment. Next in line was a 4-piece band and 4 companies of infantry commanded by Henry Millard. Finally, at the end of the line, came the newly minted Colonel Lamar and his command of 61 cavalrymen. They were positioned about a half-mile up the bayou to the right and would circle around to the south and strike the Mexican cavalry. A rise in the terrain covered the movements of the Texas Army as they quietly advanced. They came into view about 200 yards out of the barricades that the Mexican Army had erected, and it was about then they were first detected. A bugler on the right side of the Mexican encampment signaled the advance of the Texian enemy. Then the Texians advanced at double quick time. Houston, riding before the main body of the army, waved his hat, and the cavalry advanced, as did the infantry and artillery, passing through the steep part of a ravine and then up a slope on the far side. Houston gave the order to fire the cannon. The men were to remain silent until the first volley, which was only to be fired on his order. Now was the time for sword and fire. Hockley launched an attack by the Twin Sisters. The cannons belched forth a deadly assault of shrapnel and broken horseshoes into the Mexican camp. As Shakespeare said, the cannons have their bowels full of wrath, and ready mounted as they spit forth their iron indignation against your walls. The small band, including a freedman called Dick the Drummer, and flutist Frederick Limsky, who was either from Poland, Germany, or Czechoslovakia, struck up music of the love song, Will You Come to the Bower I Have Shaded for You? The lyrics by Irish poet Thomas Moore might have been on the minds of some of the attackers as they proceeded to their bloody work. Will you come to the bower I have shaded for you? Our bed shall be roses all spangled with dew. Will you, will you, will you, will you come to the bower? There, under the bower on roses you'll lie, with a blush on your cheek but a smile in your eye. Will you, will you, will you, will you? Smile, my beloved. The men kept low and held their fire as they advanced under fire. Then, 20 paces from the barricade, Houston ordered, kneel, shoot, low, fire. It was there, about 60 yards from the Mexican line, that the Texans finally fired their first shots. Many of the balls from that first volley did damage. Houston waved his hat so all could see as he ordered, forward, charge, remember the Alamo, remember Goliad. Colonel Sherman and the 2nd Regiment, including Secretary of War Thomas Rusk and Juan Seguin and the Tejano Volunteer Company, attacked the enemy to the left. They were the first to break through the Mexican army's line. They drove the Mexican right into the center. The Mexican soldiers broke ranks on their right flank, and the 2nd Regiment followed in hot pursuit. Captain Robert Calder, fighting with the 1st Regiment, later recalled that Sherman and the 2nd Regiment, quote, had the honor of breaking the right wing of the enemy before we attacked the center. Seguin and his compatriots are credited with capturing Martin Perfecto de Cos, Santa Anna's brother-in-law, and Colonel Juan N. Almonte. In the Mexican camp followers and their children panicked and ran about in search of fathers and husbands. The raw recruits also panicked and hindered the veterans who were seeking to set up a defense. Even the best Mexican shots had difficulty firing downhill at the rapidly moving attackers. Following the breakthrough of their 2nd Regiment, the rest of the line attacked the Mexican camp's breastworks. The battle cry of the Texians and Tejanos filled the air. Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad. Recuerden de Alamo. Recuerden de Goliad. The battle cry filled many of the members of the Mexican army with terror, and they attempted to flee. Some Mexican troops attempted to respond to the attack. El Volcan, the Mexican artillery piece, fired a volley. General Manuel Fernandez Castrillon, the officer who had attempted to spare the lives of men at the Alamo, tried his best to organize the Mexican soldiers into forming a resistance. Thomas J. Rusk, the Secretary of War, tried to save Castrillon, but his efforts were in vain. A volley of Texian bullets cut Castrillon down. Lamar and the Texas cavalry surprised and overwhelmed Santa Anna's cavalry. Unmounted horses ran throughout the camp. The attack at the center of the line, breaking through the breastworks, became a matter of violent hand-to-hand life-or-death struggle. Rifles turned into cudgels, skulls cracking, bones breaking, throats cut, blades hacking, blood flowing, lives ending and souls departing under the coastal Texas afternoon sun. The fighting must have been intense. The Mexican soldiers stationed at the breastworks with El Volcan died fighting. One Texian soldier wrote, quote, "It will not do to say that the Mexicans were cowardly and would not fight. They fought long and well. They commenced firing upon us at the distance of 400 yards and kept it up incessantly until we had scaled their breastworks. Many of them stood in battle until their brains were dashed out with clubbed guns. Their bodies lay thick around their artillery. The man with the fuse was shot in the act of applying it, and the cannon was captured, loaded." Houston tried to direct the attack from out in front of the line. He had 2 horses shot out from beneath him. The second time his horse went down, a rifle ball had struck Houston's right ankle. Undeterred, he mounted again as his boot filled with blood. Within 18 minutes, the battle for control of the field was over. The breastworks had been breached, El Volcan was seized, and Burleson's volunteers and Millard's camp made it into the Mexican camp. Mexican soldiers fled into the marshes, in the north, into the bayou, into the open prairie. The final resistance occurred near the marshes at the back of the camp. Colonel Juan Almonte tried to rally some of the fleeing soldiers to no avail. The Texian attackers were too much for them. The battle, for all intents and purposes, was over. But the killing continued for at least an hour and a half. Houston and the officers tried to exert control over the men, but whatever discipline they had managed to maintain until the attack was gone. Houston gave Colonel William Allen command of a 15-man squad responsible for catching up with the pursuing Texans and stopping them from wanton killing. Houston wanted to get his men under control. What if more Mexican troops, aside from Coast, were on their way to join Santa Anna, even though the bridge had been destroyed? What if they could get through? What if 2,000 or 3,000 more under Filasola arrived? Eventually, the killing did slow. The Mexican soldiers that weren't slaughtered were gathered as prisoners and marched back. The Texians started to try to make sense of their situation. One very important question that remained unanswered at that point was this: where was Santa Anna? Was he among the dead? Had he been captured? Where was he? Santa Anna had escaped. What had he been doing in the tent while the Texian army silently stalked up through the prairie grass? The honest answer is we do not know. Leaving his tent, he witnessed chaos. He saw Houston sword in hand on the dappled gray horse. He put into action the words of Homer, better to flee from death and feel its grip. If he could reach the troops commanded by Filasola, perhaps he could return and finally crush these brash Texian pirates and land grabbers that were attempting to usurp the territorial authority of Mexico. He grabbed the reins of a horse, swung up into the saddle, and rode through the mayhem and din of war. He rode as if his life depended on it, because it did. A year later, trying to absolve himself of his failure, Santa Anna tried to blame others, including the slain Castrillon. But he absolved himself of any responsibility in this passage. Quote, "In view of Houston's march, communicated to me by the advance guard at Lynchburg, I was now in a position to choose the location for battle, and I shut up the enemy in the low marshy angle of the country where its retreat was cut off by Buffalo Bayou and the San Jacinto. Their left was opposed by our right, protected by the woods on the banks of the bayou, their right covered by our 6-pounder and my cavalry. I myself occupied the highest part of the terrain. Is this position compatible with the fatal lack of foresight of which I am accused? Everything favored our country and the cause which we were defending in its name. Lastly, in order that nothing be lacking to our good luck, the enemy was repulsed in a skirmish on the evening of the 20th, and it did not believe that the troops brought by General Coast were really in reinforcements, but took them to be a ruse by means of which we were trying to make our troops appear larger, by causing a detachment sent out the night before to march back to camp. If, then, everything was favorable, if everything had been foreseen, and the operation well conducted, what was the cause of the fateful defeat of San Jacinto? It was the excessive number of raw recruits in the 500 men under the command of General Coase. As is well known, such recruits contribute little in sustaining a battle, but caused the very grave evil of introducing disorder with their irregular operations among tried veterans, especially in a surprise. A cargo of supplies I had ordered not to be brought, and the guarding of which reduced the 500 men that I had asked for to a bare 100 was also a cause. The capture of an order that was sent to me from Thompson's, as well as that of the officer bringing it, was likewise a cause. The fatigue and lack of food of the 500 men of General Coase's and of my escort, an imperious necessity that made me allow them time for their rations, was no less a crime. The disdain with which a constantly fleeing enemy was generally viewed by our troops, well deserved up to this time, though carried to an extreme, was another cause. The very inaccessibility of the ground we occupied was itself a cause, for without a close vigilance, such as I had emphatically ordered, it permitted the enemy to occupy successfully the woods to the right, as it did in an act of desperation. None of these causes was the result of neglect on my part, or the acts immediately emanating from me. I, therefore, can only be held responsible for having a sickly and weak body, on account of which, after having spent the previous day marching, the night watching, and the entire morning on horseback, I yielded to a repose that unfortunately the time allowed the troops brought up by General Costas made possible, and which in moments of greater danger, however, I would not have indulged in. As General-in-Chief, I fulfilled my duty by issuing the necessary orders for the vigilance of our camp. As a man, I succumbed to an imperious necessity of nature, for which I do not believe that a charge can be justly brought against any general, much less if such a rest is taken at the middle of the day, under a tree, and in the very camp itself. This proves also that I did not abandon myself immoderately to the comforts and pleasant well-being that our human condition requires, a failing which the greatest men of our age, including the military men of our century, have not been able to escape without being accused of carelessness or lack of foresight. It was fate, therefore, and fate alone, that dipped the wings of victory that was about to crown our efforts. Though I do not flatter myself that my operations are above reproach, in spite of what has been briefly stated, I do not believe that persons of judgment and sane criteria and thinking military men who are free from bias will fail to admit how unfounded have been the charges by which it has been attempted to represent me before the world as a conceited and overproud general without knowledge, without a plan, without foresight, without caution, and, in a word, without any of those qualities that adorn a military leader of my kind, who in other campaigns has known how to be victorious, but whose name, now that misfortune has placed his very life in jeopardy, is dishonored, while the nation that confided its defense to him is accused of having exercised little judgment, at least in so doing. We were overcome at San Jacinto, and I was taken before the chief of the Texans, Houston, on the 22nd. I endured untold sufferings of all kinds, but as I have had the sorrow of learning, only by ending my life could they have placed me beyond the recriminations of my fellow citizens. He also wrote, "The conduct of General Castrillon and of other officers to whom the vigilance of our camp in full view of the enemy was entrusted contributed considerably to the already mentioned misfortune. I regret to have to discuss an individual who is dead, one whom I always regarded with esteem. Likewise, I regret to have to speak of others who are still living, but duty obliges me to relate the facts as they were. I have positive evidence to prove that all the time I was sleeping, the said general occupied himself with making his toilet and changing his clothes, and that when the enemy attacked and surprised our advance guards, he was whiling away his time in a party with the other officers of my staff. He did not inspect our outposts a single time, and his example was followed by the other officers. Thus part of the troops were sleeping, while those who were awake, not being vigilant, permitted the enemy to carry out a surprise that could not have been more complete had it taken place in the middle of the night. As a result, it was easy for the enemy to take possession of the woods on our right with only 116 men, in spite of being defended by 3 chosen companies. Though they outnumbered the enemy, they offered no resistance. This was the source of the encouragement that enabled the enemy to continue the charge, as well as the cause of the confusion in our camp, increased by the panic that possessed the recruits, who, unable to use their arms, permitted the enemy to assassinate them in cold blood. It is true that General Castrillon conducted himself with extraordinary bravery, as I have stated, during the last moments of the engagement, but his efforts then were useless, and before he breathed his last, his remorse must have been great if he paused to think how he neglected his duty at a time when he should have attended to it. A few lines later, Santa Anna added, "The force under my command was superior to the quality of that of the enemy. It was well supplied with food and munitions, and it held an advantageous position. That of the enemy was inferior in number. It was cut off by Buffalo Bayou and the San Jacinto and occupied a disadvantageous position. The enemy was without food. An attempt to draw it into battle had been made on the previous day before the arrival of our reinforcement, but the challenge had been refused. Who, under such conditions, would have wanted to mobilize a whole army, losing precious moments in the meantime? Who could have doubted victory I appeal to the impartial judgment of the intelligent classes, feeling confident that, far from siding with envy and malice and imputing carelessness, precipitation, and lack of foresight on my part, they will admit that judgment, foresight, and discretion were exercised in considering the circumstances, and that if these did not result in victory as it was expected, it was through no lack of plan, nor failure of coordination in the operations, nor the dispositions of the General-in-Chief. Having demonstrated, as I have done, that the catastrophe of San Jacinto was caused purely by the faults and carelessness of some of my subordinates and the disregard of orders by others, there remains nothing for me but to deplore my participation in the engagement. My regrets are mitigated, however, when I remember that I did everything that was in my power, exceeding the duties of a general-in-chief, to serve my country well. I find no other excess in my conduct than my zeal for the interests of the country, placing them above my own, and subordinating everything else to the desire to defend them well and to cover with glory the arms entrusted to me. Fortune turned its back upon me at the very moment when my efforts were to be crowned with success, preventing me from having the satisfaction of presenting a new laurel to the nation and leaving my desire unknown. Jose Enrique de la Pena had a different perspective than His Excellency Santa Anna. De la Pena wrote, "Among the victims immolated by the criminal and unforgivable carelessness that has been occupying our attention, we find General Manuel Fernandez Castrillon, who perished while bravely trying to restore order in our ranks. Colonel Don Jose Batres, our aide to the commander-in-chief, who was overtaken in flight and cut down without offering any resistance. The courageous Lieutenant Colonel Esteban Mora and the amiable Don Marcial Peralta Aguirre of the same rank, and many other meritorious officers, among them Don Santiago Luelmo, Don Nestor Guzman Larumbe, Vallejo Roca, and others whom I do not recall at the moment. Among the 730 prisoners whose lives were spared, perhaps to suffer greater tortures than death itself, were 50 leaders and officers, including the commander-in-chief, his secretary, and his chaplain, whose names are found in the accompanying narrative." De la Pena continued and said, "Houston has purposely withheld from his dispatch the circumstance to which he owed his victory, in order not to diminish the renown it has bestowed on him. For certainly, without such a complete surprise, the more reprehensible because it was at midday, he never could have obtained it. General Santa Anna had under his command forces superior in both number and discipline. He had excellent officers, and though there were some recruits in his ranks, these were the lesser number. Of choice companies he had 10, and among the fusiliers of the other contingents there were veteran soldiers who on more than one occasion had decked their foreheads with the laurels of victory. Houston, on the contrary, had forces inferior in number, which, though composed of men with courage, were not subject to the discipline that makes the soldier. They did not follow any specific tactics, nor had they mastered fundamentals of war. It can be said of them that they were recruits, courageous men, who tried only to save or sell their lives dearly, for which reason the defeat at San Jacinto appears the more humiliating. For in defeat, disgrace is quite possible, just as one can be vanquished without necessarily losing honor. But on the 21st April, everything was lost: men, arms, and reputation," end quote from De la Pena. The battle had indeed lasted officially only 18 minutes. 18 minutes for victory. Then came the time for death, and the angel of death pushed the soldiers of Texas on, and the carnage and slaughter went on and on and on as they chased down the fleeing Mexican soldiers. Musket balls pierced the skulls of those that fled into Peggy's Lake. Surrendering soldiers were bludgeoned to death. So it goes. I don't presume to sit in judgment on the acts of the dead. What happened on that field of battle happened, and nothing can change it. In Homer's Iliad, Achilles says, "We men are wretched things." And whether justified by rage and the desire for vengeance or not, Wretched things were done once the Mexican encampment had been taken in 18 minutes, a mirror to the wretched things performed at the Alamo and Goliad. Laureled with victory on that day, who's to say that the events did not cause nightmares for some time to come, just as the veterans celebrated their heroic acts, or perhaps some just as well might have slept peacefully and with bliss in their later years.
For Pillar Sports, a podcast for sports fans, made by sports fans. Join Chris and Randy every week as they dive deep into football, basketball, baseball, and professional wrestling. Catch For Pillar Sports on all major platforms. And remember, keep on talking sports.
The great visionary leader of India, Mahatma Gandhi, said, "It is health that is real wealth, and not pieces of gold and silver." Listen to the Healthy Grocer radio show on your favorite podcast platform. We know that health is our greatest wealth, and we will be discussing all aspects of natural healing. Explore everything from supplements, superfoods, and healthy lifestyle choices to help conquer stress and boost productivity. Top industry experts and natural health professionals join us for a deep dive into our healing journey. You can find the Healthy Grocer radio show on demand every day wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And remember, health is your greatest wealth.
You are listening to Texas History Lessons, a slow walk through Texas history made in Texas by a Texan for everyone, everywhere.
That's going to do it for this episode, this part 4 of Texas History Lessons account of the Battle of San Jacinto. We'll be back in the next episode with a lot of personal accounts of the battle and further comments about the end of the battle and the aftermath. And then we'll see where it takes us after that. You can listen to everything all at once. It's some people prefer some shorter episodes, so I'm broken it up into these shorter episodes. So thanks to Derek and Clinton for theme music. Please be sure to subscribe and share the show, whether you're just listening to it as a podcast or on YouTube. It would be appreciated. So until we come back and look at a lot of really in-depth personal accounts of the battle, take care of yourself, take care of one another, be kind. Adios.